The horseman that we'll spend the least amount of time on this class is famine, but this is not to discount it as a factor in the history of the late Middle Ages or indeed of a lot of other periods. In fact, famine has been the source of some of the greatest mortality, like mass mortality in history. The Great Famines, which were human manufactured of the 20th century, like the famine in Ukraine and Russia in the 1920s and 30s, and then the famine that came with the Great Leap Forward of Mao Zedong, the Cultural Revolution in China of Mao Zedong. These killed tens of millions of people. Now, again, they were human manufactured, right? Governments took food supplies away from people and made it so they starved to death and all of that, right? But even famines that were not necessarily caused by human action or primarily caused by human action were significant factors. And we're going to talk here about the Great Famine of the late Middle Ages, which occurs in the early 14th century, about a generation before the Black Death. We'll talk about its association with the Black Death, its possible relationship. But the first question I want to ask here is, what causes famine, right? Is this, I've already sort of hinted at this, that famine can be caused by natural disasters or sort of natural phenomena. If there are a series of bad harvests, we've already talked in the last lecture about how people in the Middle Ages lived very close to the edge in terms of like the food that they grew. They only had a yield of maybe 4-1 of the seeds they planted. And so if there was a bad harvest, right, and that yield dropped to 3-1 or 2-1 or something like that, it was barely worth planting. They had to save a certain number of seeds to plant the following year, which meant they had very little food to eat over the course of the year. And so they would have to try to supplement their diets in other ways. If there was a series of bad harvests, as there were in the 13 teens, then this just became disastrous. But in addition to the natural causes of this, there are certainly there's certainly human aid that exacerbates the consequences of famine. And this is most true for the famines of the 20th century, but it's also true, I think, if we look at the Great Famine of the late Middle Ages and maybe other historical incidents of famine, that if governments don't take effective action against this, right, if they stand by and if they make really poor decisions about how to mitigate the effects of the famine, the famine can actually become worse. And if government policies in the first place, or just sort of the wielding of power in unjust ways, can create famine, and certainly war and pestilence both, right, can lead to famine. And that is true in the late Middle Ages and a lot of other periods. That if mercenary armies, as we've talked about with the 100 Years' War and some of these late medieval wars, if mercenary armies are marauding and pillaging and raping in the countryside and stealing food from peasants, well, the peasants are, going to probably starve to death, or they're going to be in serious dire straits at that point. And if this is widespread and common enough, this can produce a famine, or it can exacerbate an already existing famine. If that's coupled with a bad harvest, or 2 or 3, or a several year stretch of these, it can just become one of the worst disasters for human beings possible. So we need to look at the relationship with all of these things. The Great Famine is something that has been studied a fair amount in the last maybe 30 years or so. It was known certainly before that, and it was various scholars gave different explanations for it, which we'll get into. But the general narrative or timeline of it is there seems to have been a several years long series of bad harvests in the Mediterranean region first, in the early 13 teens, from around 1311 to 1315. And then this was followed by an even longer period of famine in northern Europe that stretched from 1315 to the early 1320s. Northern Europe meaning places like northern France, Germany, and particularly the British Isles, right? These were hit very hard. And the documentation is best for the British Isles here, so we have a fair number of sources that come from England and Scotland and Ireland and places like that that talk about the effects of the famine. And what they tell us, and this is all anecdotal at this point, just looking at these sources, is that there were incredibly long stretches of rain. In 1315, an English document, or I guess is corroborated with several documents, it claims that there were 100 straight days of rain. Now, if you've ever spent time in England or lived in England, you'll know that it rains a lot there anyway, but this was especially bad, right? They never saw the sun, and this meant that the grain did not ripen, and much of the harvest remained underwater, and they were not able to get the food out of the ground, either for themselves, either for the humans or for the animals. The hay didn't ripen either, could not be cut and harvested and dried, and all of those things that were necessary for providing sustenance for animals. And so both humans and animals died as a result of this. Now, possible explanations, there have been several. In the late 18th century, there was an English philosopher named Thomas Malthus, who came up with a notion of what he called a periodic crisis in human history. This is an early attempt to apply science and scientific modeling to explain human behavior. From this came all of the social sciences that we know today, things like sociology and anthropology and political science and psychology and all of that. But the origins of this were in the so-called Second Scientific Revolution in the late 18th, early 19th century. Well, Malthus was a key figure in all of this. And he suggested that there were these periodic checks where the human population grew too large and outstripped its ability to sustain itself from what it could grow in food, and that there would be these periodic reversals of human population growth, right? And he targeted the 14th century as one of the exhibit A for this theory. And even modern scholars in the 20th century embraced this. They saw this as really good scientific modeling. But the problem with the Malthusian thesis is that this just seems to occur by magic. It doesn't take into account, sort of natural factors and other things. It doesn't, and there's a lot of evidence that kind of flies in the face of this, that, this is not necessarily a trend in human history, that we have these instances where population is obviously not maxing out the resources, and yet we have a massive mortality due to famine or plague or something like that, right? So that has mostly become passé, but it is still an interesting and provocative attempt to apply, as I said, scientific modeling to understand human behavior and human history. Climate change is something that scholars tended to ignore for quite a long time, but with the interest in climate change due to global warming and these sorts of things starting in maybe the 1980s, scholars started to look at this as a factor. And in the documentation, it talks about the harsh winters and other sort of climatic phenomena that were unusual for the period, things like the long periods of rain. And then scholars went to sort of to corroborate the human accounts. They went to hard scientific evidence in the form of things like tree rings and ice cores taken in places like Greenland and Antarctica, and discovered that in fact there is good scientific evidence that the weather was bad in these years. And this, of course, has become an explanation that resonates with people in our contemporary time period because of the concerns over global warming. Maybe it's a kind of warning, to take action. Of course, this is not necessarily human-caused climate change like we see in the modern day, where we're pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and all of that. But it nevertheless, demonstrates the problems that can be caused by climate change. In this case, a period of global cooling rather than global warming, but disastrous nevertheless. The pathology, or what happens to the human body and by extension to human societies, is one of the factors in the Great Famine that we should pay some attention to. And Aberth goes over this in a fair detail, and so I don't want to kind of belabor the points that he's making. I'd encourage you to read the chapter in Aberth, which I think is very good. But people don't tend to die of starvation. It takes a very long time to die of starvation. People who have gone on hunger strikes and eventually died because of their lack of food, like Bobby Sands, the one of the leaders of the Irish Republican Army in the 1980s, fighting for the independence of Ireland from Northern Ireland from English control and all of that. It took him 66 days, I believe, to die after not eating. And by the time he died, he had long been deaf, blind, and completely, non-coherent, right? That's not what we see. People are not starving to death per se. They do become extremely desperate, right? That desperation is described in the documentation from this period. But part of the problem with starvation or lack of malnourishment, we could just say, is that this leads to a lot of other diseases. People become more susceptible to other diseases. And they become desperate to eat anything, and they start to eat things that are not easily digestible or completely non-digestible, but for the human body. There are, of course, descriptions of cannibalism and other things that can't be corroborated or verified necessarily in this period, but it just goes to show that the desperation that people felt, that even if these accusations of cannibalism were not actually true, it was conceivable that people could eat other human beings. That's how desperate they were. One of the common things that seems to have happened in the Great Famine was that people ate grain that was not properly ripened and had fungus in it, and suffered from this disease called ergotism, which is, has like hallucinations and these sorts of things that is quite common. Fungus. The ergot fungus grows very well on unripened grain, so it makes sense that this would have happened. And this maybe led to some of the phenomena that we see described in the sources of this. The death toll, there are various estimates for this. Maybe as many as 25% of the population of Northern Europe perished in this period due to the Great Famine. I think that's the most liberal estimate. More conservative estimates maybe put it around 10%. Of course, we'll never know, but in either case, this is whether you go with the low estimate or the high estimate or somewhere in the middle, this is a terrible tragedy, right? One of the things that scholars have worked on a fair amount, and there are various opinions on this, Aberth offers, I think, an interesting analysis of this whole idea, but the people who were children during the Great Famine and who managed to survive this probably had weakened constitutions. And even if, malnourishment does not necessarily make one susceptible to an infectious bacterial disease like bubonic plague, it would, if they were already of a weakened constitution, it would mean that they were more likely to die of a contractable disease like bubonic plague, right? And so the incredibly high mortality that we see in 1348, which is never fully replicated in any later outbreak of plague, and there are lots of outbreaks of plague, like every few years there's an outbreak of plague. That initial mortality in the first outbreak of plague in the middle of the 14th century may be partially due to as I said, the weakened constitution, right? The lack of strength that people had because they suffered from severe starvation early in their lives. It is a provocative thought. I think that it's a responsible one. I think Aberth's explanation for that is quite good. But you can, determine your own opinion about this. Government responses to famine tend to be mostly ineffective, both ancient and medieval and modern, right? We see a number of instances where, famine occurs and governments have to make a decision about, what do we do to mitigate the effects of the lack of food. Of course, there are stories in the Bible that about this, the story of Joseph in Egypt and the Pharaoh and all of that, which is recounted in not only in the Bible, but in, the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. But that was probably an inspiration for, government policy, how to handle the famine and all of that. There are two, I think, the phenomena that we tend to see that are most popular here. One of these is to try to fix prices at a certain level. to establish a price ceiling, right, where grain cannot be sold for more than X amount, right? Now, economically, logically, this sort of makes sense, and it's easy to see why officials would say, well, the merchants are just being too greedy. They're charging prices that are too high for the food, and we've got to do away with that. But in truth, if less food is being grown, if there is less supply, then the simple economic forces of supply and demand will correct the price. And if you try to tinker with that, then all you're going to do is produce shortage. And the shortage is already sort of there, but this can be exacerbated by price fixing. This does create black markets. There are accounts of merchants refusing to sell their foodstuffs because the officials were charging prices that were too high. Even people, preferring to go to prison rather than submit to the price fixing. Try as they might, these government officials and even kings like Edward II of England, or Louis the Tenth, I think at this point, of France, right? They try to portray themselves as like the wise pharaoh of the story in the book of Genesis. But in truth, this did not. Most of the measures they took were really ineffective. Another one is they prosecuted hoarders, right? If they sent officials into towns and villages and tried to find people who were hoarding grain, and then punished them for that and took their grain away, which probably only made things worse certainly for that family, maybe for everybody else, right? Chances are hoarders are trying to sell it. They're just trying to sell it out of the view of government officials who are imposing these price fixing arrangements. And black markets can actually be quite effective. This is not to necessarily condone the practice of black market, but they're almost inevitable in a situation like this where demand is going to outstrip supply, and you've got governments trying to tinker with the prices. And so, again, long and short of it is the government measures are almost entirely ineffective and even make things worse in many ways. Popular responses to this, I think that the main response people had in terms of like what can we do to stave off the famine or make this go away is they appealed to God. They did religious things, right? And they tended to point out the hypocrisy of their leaders. And there are a number of texts that originate from this period. I've assigned you one this week called The Simony, which is originally a poem in Middle English. I've given you a prose translation of it so you don't get the full effect of the poetry. But nevertheless, we can see there that, in fact, let's go to that. All right. You who will stay, listen, and you will hear why war and destruction are in the land, and manslaughter has come, why hunger and dearth on earth have seized the poor, why beasts are starving and wheat is so dear. Listen, whoever will, for I will not lie. Heaven blessed may be he who listens here for a while. How plenty and mirth are downtrodden by pride, how it has turned steadfastness and truth to treachery, and how all poor men sing, alas, I am dying from hunger. I'm gonna explain why people are dying from hunger. Now, notice he doesn't need to talk about the famine. He says war and destruction are in the land. So war and famine seem to go together here. And in fact, this is written in England, and there were a fair number of wars even in this period of the Great Famine, which is, it predates the beginning of the 100 Years' War by a couple of decades, but we've already got a lot of war going on. England and Scotland were fighting against each other. Edward the Bruce invaded. Not to be confused with Robert the Bruce, who was, I think, his father. But Edward the Bruce invaded Ireland in the 13 teens around the time of the famine and almost certainly made things worse there, right? So the war and famine go together here. And his explanation is basically like, we are rotting at the top. Our leaders are terrible. At the court of Rome, where truth should begin, he, meaning truth, is forbidden from the palace and does not enter for fear. Even if the Pope called him in, he would stay outside, right? So the Pope himself is corrupt and doesn't care about truth here. He criticizes the archbishops and bishops and other churchmen. He goes on to criticize like Franciscan and Dominican friars and Carmelites and Augustinians. All of these churchmen are only out for themselves. They're greedy. They're not really helping the poor. If somebody offers to pay them a lot of money to do a service for them, then they will do it. But otherwise, they're going to reject the poor. But then he goes on to criticize government officials as well, right? And he says a fair amount about this. He talks about the doctors, the physicians. The physicians are greedy and they don't help poor people. They only help people who can pay lots of money. And even when they do take the money, they often give just sort of quack remedies that don't do anything, he says. And so by my soul, this world is cursed, okay? Everybody is false. And is it any wonder then that we have famine in the land? The nobility are similarly corrupt here. This is written by, of course, a learned person. It's a written text, and so one wonders exactly the identity of the author here. I'm not aware of that. I mean, this is an anonymous poem, but this is probably either a churchman or a member of the nobility writing this, and so it makes sense that they would have knowledge probably of these elites and their practices, and so chivalry is crippled and wickedly ordered, and knights are no longer the heroic people they used to be, and all of that, right? And the king himself even is corrupt, or he allows corruption to run rampant. And so the long and short of it is, because of all the falseness in the land, God Almighty of heaven has bound us with his bond and sent cold, cruel weather. There's the example or the evidence of the climate change caused bad weather that led to the famine. Yet no one pays attention. We have no fear of his great might, but it is well seen that God is angry with the world. All that was play and game is turned to sorrow and pain. He gave us plentiful fruits of all kinds, yet we ever acted with wickedness against God. When he sees the world is so perverse, he sends his visitation onto the earth and gives us grief. When beasts are starving and grain is dear, there's the famine, and there is hunger and pestilence in each land, as you may hear everywhere. Unless we amend our ways, worse will come. So that's the ultimate assessment of all of this. Okay. So interesting document from this period of the Great Famine. And we should note, and some of this comes out in that, right, that there are a lot of other really terrible things for the societies of the late Middle Ages, occurring simultaneously. The papacy had been sort of taken captive by the French king, for instance, and had moved their court to Avignon in southern France, which was technically papal territory, but they were very much under the thumb of the French king. This damaged the reputation of the Pope and the papal curia irrevocably. It never really recovered fully from this, at least not for a couple of centuries. And so, this is something that's on the mind of a lot of people, right? The Pope himself is now corrupt and is the puppet of the French king, and that seems to come out in that poem. I mentioned wars already. Aberth notes, and I think this is an interesting association, that the witchcraft accusations that really begin in, the late Middle Ages, we don't see a lot of witchcraft accusations or even a terrible concern about witchcraft in the High Middle Ages in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. But starting in the 14th century, there's a significant uptick in this. Now, witchcraft I would say most, or at least a good number of witchcraft accusations tend to be associated with witches' supposed ability to hurt agriculture. This is a general phenomenon. And so Aberth hints or suggests that the concern over witchcraft, which grows over the next 2 or 3 centuries until it reaches a height during the witch craze of the late 16th and early 17th century, this may have originated or emerged from the period of the Great Famine, or that famine itself was at least a partial cause of this growing concern over witchcraft, which I think is a responsible and really interesting idea. All right. So a lot of information about famine. Hopefully that was comprehensible. And if you have questions about it, please ask them on the discussion boards. Thanks.